He cut my lanyard with ceremonial scissors. There are sounds that register in the body before the mind decides what they mean. The paper crinkle of a program being unfolded, laughter that is a fraction too loud for the room, the metallic whisper of scissors against metal. In that instant, the auditorium went small and bright, like a field of view narrowed by a magnifying lens. Kieran Ashford smiled as if he were opening a present. I felt the titanium collar slip from my neck. What followed almost cost billions. My name is Aerys Thorne. For 16 years, I designed the security that people told themselves couldn't be breached because they called it certified, air-gapped, hardened. I built systems that lived under the hum of fluorescent lights, beneath concrete, below layers of process and precaution. I learned to think in pulses and handshakes, in physical things that refused to be moved by press releases or keynote slides. I wore a hardware token on a fiber optic lanyard not because I loved jewelry. I wore it because it was a living part of an authorization chain, an instrument that literally listened to my heartbeat and answered only to it. If that sentence sounds theatrical, good. A lot of myths surround the cloud and zero trust, and whatever the innovation team has called its latest crusade. My work is less romantic. Magnets, tapes, optical transceivers, stamped proof of custody. There is a distinct smell in subterranean server rooms, ozone, machine oil, the faint melancholic tang of melted solder, and the sound is a steady, reassuring drone. You learn to read that drone the way a sailor reads wind. When it changes, you notice. Before I tell you what happened when a pair of scissors severed the fiber around my neck, let me explain why that lanyard existed, how it worked, and why removing it was not a symbolic gesture, not a stunt. It was a trigger. The token itself was unromantic, a Class 7 hardware security module. Think of it as a safe inside a safe, with a choke point so small you could only reach it with very specific, very authorized tools. Its private keys, the mathematical objects that let us reconstruct secrets and unlock systems, were generated inside the module and never left. The module had optical and biometric links, a fiber optic loop that carried a continuous optical handshake, and a biometric coupling that verified the presence of the custodian. The system required a continuous confirmation, not "you were right 5 minutes ago," but "you are present now, and your pulse matches the registration." If that handshake stopped abruptly in a way that suggested violent interference, a cut, a sudden absence without proper decommission, the system interpreted it as hostile capture. Hostile capture is a blunt term, but it is designed to prevent a different nightmare. Someone physically grabbing a custodian, wrenching access from them, and walking out with the most sensitive keys and information. The protocol was simple and merciless. If the custodian's continuous handshake was severed in a way the token flagged as emergency, then the module executed a secure zeroization of private keys. In lay terms, the keys were shredded, not deleted in a way a technician could undo, but destroyed beyond practical restoration. The device would also issue a chain of automated notifications to our federal partners, DCSA, DoD audits, other dependent certification authorities. Facility clearance for certain operations would be suspended by policy, pending an investigation. In short, the system traded availability for safety, better to render systems unusable than to let them be clandestinely copied. I had supervised the design, deployment, and periodic recertification of that mechanism for over a decade and a half. We had fielded it in labs and then in production, in rooms with one lock in front of another. We had taken photographs of sealed cabinets, witnessed the tamper evidence seals, notarized custody logs, and stored cold backups on magnetic tape in a vault in Utah so that, if the worst happened, we could rebuild from trusted media. Those tapes were heavy enough to bruise a palm. They smelled like particle board and solvent. They mattered. Project Velocity smelled differently from the outset. The word velocity was artfully chosen. Fast, modern, inevitable. It was the kind of name that comes with a logo and a rollout deck. Modernization, platform unification, single pane of glass. Kieran Ashford arrived with an MBA and the charisma of someone who had sold an app to an appraiser once and assumed every problem was a product-market fit issue. He wore a blazer unbuttoned over a hoodie and had an answer for every legacy problem that didn't require thinking about the furniture in the room beneath the floor. You could see it in the company manifesto he quoted: speed over process, disruption over discipline, optics over nuance. Where we had built silence and redundancy, he wanted noise and novelty. Kieran spoke to the entire staff in a town hall, palms open, with a slide that showed a stylized cloud and the words "everything, everywhere." The crowd, mid-career engineers in polos, new hires in curated secondhand suits, a handful of defense folks who tolerated PR, applauded because it was what they expected at a product launch. I went to him privately before the announcement.
I say went to him. More accurate is that I slipped into his temporary office, a room of pale wood and too bright glass, and spoke without theatrics about the systems that kept the company trusted by federal customers. I explained the optical handshake, the custody model, the Class 7 requirement. I explained the role of those cold tapes in Utah.
I told him, plainly and forcefully, that our federal auditors did not accept the word cloud as shorthand for secure custody of classified logistics, and any move to a consumer-grade facial recognition vendor would be a non-starter for the contracts portfolio. He listened long enough to pretend he was listening. When I finished, he smiled with a patronizing tilt, as if we had finished a tutorial. "Aerys," he said, "we have to stop telling ourselves that security is an architecture. It's a posture. People want speed. Our competitors are shipping. We need to move." Jared Frey, at that point acting head of IT, was young, risk-averse, and in debt to expediency. He had been given a mandate to make the transition administratively painless. His job required him to balance two pressures: his career ambitions and the reality that the compliance officers on the other side of the contract would walk if they smelled a bait and switch. He tried to be a buffer. In practice, he became a translator. He took Kieran's velocity language and rephrased it into technical tickets on the backlog board. I documented everything. That is a ritual in our world. We write things down as a way to resist the seductive motion of charisma. I drafted a memorandum addressed to the executive committee, to the board, to legal. I printed it on corporate letterhead and had it notarized, not because notarization is a magic legal shield, but because a stamped, dated witness is harder to shrug off in the kind of boardroom theater Kieran liked to stage. I sent copies to Miriam Cole, our general counsel, and to a handful of people in my immediate chain of custody. I left a sealed copy with Marcus, the security lead, a man who had been at the company long enough to make the coffee machine respect him. 3 hours before the town hall, I mailed a copy to an address outside the company, my own lawyer's office. It is a small, mundane action that feels stupidly cautious until it isn't. That memo mattered later in ways that would be obvious and in ways that would be subtle. But at the time, it felt like the only respectful way to treat the risk I saw. I tried, quietly, to frame an alternative. We could compartmentalize. We could pilot modern user interfaces while preserving the custody model for classified proofs. We could, in other words, allow the product team their pane of glass without handing them the vault's keys. Kieran saw such suggestions as hedging, a refusal to commit. "If we do this half measure," he said at one meeting in front of Jared, "we'll never actually get modern. We have to choose." That line, "we have to choose," is how leaders calcify their vision. It leaves people who steward safety positioned as obstacles. Town Hall Day had all the trappings of a corporate festival. There were sandwiches, a string quartet inexplicably booked for an internal show, and a ceremonial ribbon, obviously. The auditorium had been lit up like a launch pad. Lawrence Ashford, Kieran's father and our CEO, was on stage, beaming with the bland stewardship that comes with inherited authority. He introduced his son with the affectionate distance of a parent watching the child play at being a statesman. I stood to the side because my instincts are not theatrical. My team had been told to attend. Security architecture is a weird mix of performance and sequester. You come to milestones with a well-controlled face. Marcus stood at the rear of the room, his posture the kind of silent vigilance one cultivates over a lifetime of custodial work. Kieran took the mic and delivered the storyline he had practiced. A new era, data liberated from shackles, integrated identity, machine learning models that would predict need states for our logistics customers before they realized there was a need. The crowd ate the language because it promised speed and comfort. I watched his hands. He moved like a man who owns his narrative. Then he pivoted to a gesture. He wanted a story prop. He wanted spectacle. It was important for branding. He was stepping down from the podium and moving towards me, smiling as if we had rehearsed this little vignette together. "To show everyone how our old constraints won't chain us anymore," he said, and the auditorium made an expectant breath. I realized, with a concrete smallness, what the spectacle required. He wanted me to surrender the hardware token. He wanted to take it and cut it. To the assembled people, it would read as symbolic. The old guard yields to new guard. To me, as the custodian, it was a proximate threat. There are formal ways to decommission a hardware token. We could schedule a change window, trigger a supervised decommission that would log out unused processes, withdraw the token's custody, and rekey the system through established processes. There are also ways to fake decommissioning that look clean in a slide deck and are catastrophic in practice. A live severance in front of the staff, unplanned and unlogged, would be read by the token as a hostile event. "Hand it over," Kieran said,
and his voice had that thin edge of someone secure enough to treat confrontation like theater. Jared, flushed at the side of the stage, gave me a look that said, "Choose your words." Miriam, somewhere in the front row, had her hand pressed against her lips. You could see the beginning of legal calculation in her eyes. I did not hand it over. I said, calmly, "Not here. Not like that." There was a murmur. Karen smiled then. "Aerys," he said, "it's theater. It's symbolic. Let the company see we're moving on." "It isn't symbolic to the device," I said. "If it thinks it was taken forcibly, it will zeroize. The keys will be destroyed. We will precipitate a hostile capture response." He laughed in that public way that makes dissent feel gratuitous. "Do you think I don't know what a token is? I just want to make a point."
It is tempting to describe that laugh as hubris. It was something simpler and more dangerous. Certainty divorced from curiosity. People who have only managed spreadsheets learn to treat risk like a reputation problem, not as a series of physical processes. He reached for my lanyard. The auditorium held its breath, the way a body holds an inhalation to prevent the sound of something fragile falling. He brought the scissors up. There is a visual I will never forget. The polished blade catching the auditorium light like a small comet, his fingers steady, the audience leaning forward to watch a ritual they expected to be harmless. I remember thinking, there are stories where the hero stops the act, where the script bends to practical people, and the show closes harmlessly. I had rehearsed a quiet refusal in my head, not a fight. I had rehearsed what I would say to a board that would later cover its ears and say, "We didn't see signs." Real life is rarely kind like that. The scissors made a crisp, small sound. The titanium collar slipped from my neck and fell into Kieran's hands. At first, nothing obvious happened. That delay is where people invent their narratives. Maybe the device was inert. Maybe it was symbolic after all. Then the token's optical link registered the abrupt loss of the continuous handshake. The device's firmware interpreted the event and moved through its decision tree. The kind of protocols we used had safeguards to prevent accidental zeroization, but they also had a deterministic response for a severance that bore signs of violent removal, immediate zeroization, and a broadcast to dependent authorities. These protocols are designed for the worst case, the scenario where a custodian is physically coerced and the adversary leaves with the device. The token began to perform its duty. A tiny LED flashed. On the stage, my hands went numb. The hum of the room thinned into a strip of noise like a wire struck. Jared's face went white. Miriam stood. Someone in the front row, a product manager, laughed for perhaps the wrong reason and then realized the laugh had been a mistake. "Did that just..." Kieran started. Then a different sound caught his attention. A ping from his phone, urgent and flat. He looked down. He had no idea what the device had just done, only that the moment he had orchestrated had taken an unanticipated turn. I had prepared for something like this in ways I had not wanted to imagine. The notarized memo, the law office copy, Marcus's sealed packet, they were all precautions against the boardroom changing the story. They were not prophylactic against the immediate technical consequences. The hardware is brutal in its logic. Better to lose availability than to retain a key that might have been copied. A red alert flooded the operations dashboard in the monitoring room. Custodian severed. Hostile capture assumed. Zeroization initiated. The monitor text was clinical and precise. My throat closed around the words. An automated message, a protocol we had built and certified, was dispatched to our contractual security partners. Things that had previously been words and procedures became reality. The facility's clearance status was flagged for suspension by the certification authority, pending incident review. Certain classes of work were effectively paused. I left the stage with awkward composure because my training is to be the instrument of clarity and confusion. I moved through the corridors smelling of cheap coffee and expense account pastries, feeling the weight of a device that had been intended to protect the nation. The automatic notifications were hitting systems. A phone in Miriam's hand lit up with alerts from auditors. "We need an override," someone said, but there is no override for a module designed to destroy its own key material when it believes the custodian is compromised. We could, of course, produce a new key, rebuild a system, re-ingest cold backups. We could get back to functionality. That process is not instantaneous. It requires physical logistics, the tapes in Utah, procedural verification, and recertification. It requires time, and time is not neutral in contract performance. In the stairwell, Jared tried to explain. "Aerys, if we ask the vendor there's a way to rekey, we can spin a cloud."
You can spin a cloud all you want, I said, but you don't have those private keys anymore. The token destroyed them. You can't ask for something that has been irretrievably erased. He looked like a young man who had just found out that his professional identity had been attached to something not actually under his control. Can't we call the manufacturer? The manufacturer cannot regenerate private keys that were never exported, I said. They can replace hardware, but replacement hardware will not replicate the previous private key. The chain of custody for the cryptographic identity has been severed. The words sounded abstract in the stairwell. For a second, I considered the performative element that had produced this catastrophe. Kieran had wanted a demonstration of no more chains. What he had achieved, unintentionally or not, was a literal severing of an anchor deeper than a PR metaphor. There is a moral dimension to hardware design that few understand. When you craft a device to be uncopyable, you accept the responsibility that its destruction is permanent. That is not a failure mode to be used as a prop. I do not want to misrepresent my composure. Inside, my pulse was a fast, irrational beat. Externally, I was a person practicing the only form of competence available, to narrate the facts and to shield others from panicked improvisation. I texted my lawyer to remind them I still had the notarized memo in their office. I told Marcus to seal certain cabinets and to prepare custody documentation.
I asked Miriam for legal guidance on immediate external communications, and she answered with a string of staccato questions. Do we notify the client? Do we inform the board? Who was our point of contact? 3 minutes after the snip, a protocol notification, automatic and formal, left our system and pinged a federal endpoint. That was the design. When the token assumed hostile capture, it notified dependent certification and security authorities. The policy that governed the token's behavior was not my invention alone. It was the conformity of 15 years of contracts and certifications designed to prevent exfiltration of classified material. It was, in the abstract, the best of our discipline. The auditorium hum shifted into a lower frequency as accountants and program managers tried to translate technology into contractual exposure. The $5 billion logistics contract, words I had always said with that same careful cadence, as if the number had a skin, had a compliance baseline that required continuous access to certified hardware and intact chains of custody. An unplanned suspension of facility clearance is not the same as an immediate contract termination, but it is not nothing either. Governments do not like uncertainty where munitions and supply chains are concerned. They issue stop work orders, they demand explanations, they look at the calendar and begin to compute penalties, alternate providers, and mission risk. Kieran realized the weight of the moment in the way people show comprehension, briefly, then with the slow recognition of someone understanding a concept that will shatter their image. He had cut a theatrical ribbon. He had not intended to engender a policy response. He had not considered that a physical device, tied to legal and operational regimes practiced by auditors and federal agencies, would not parse his intent. The module is indifferent to motives. It reads signals. A security guard, Marcus, followed me into the briefing room as the first automations landed. He held his hands in front of him like a man who had seen many things and preferred to inventory them. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. That phrase matters because in moments of doubt, you look for anchors among people who have lived in the mechanics of the work. His voice had the authority of someone who had watched too many executives mistake theater for governance. Miriam called for a closed-door meeting. Lawrence Askerd, pale and visibly shaken, arrived and sat at the head of the table with a look that suggested he had been blindsided by a child's bravado. He asked me with an almost apologetic edge, "Aerys, can you fix it? Can we put this back?" There is a temptation when someone asks a professional to fix it, to wrap the solution in optimism. The correct response in a moment like that is candor. "We can rebuild," I said, but not immediately. The private key material was destroyed. We have trusted cold backups in Utah. We can use them to reconstruct the dataset and reinitialize certified hardware. That requires retrieving those tapes, rebuilding systems from trusted media, and then recertification. That is measured in months, not minutes. Those months hung in the air like a sentence. People in the room adjusted their faces to the new reality. Jared's jaw clenched. He understood the difference between downtime and permanent loss in a new way. Miriam began to draft a communications timeline in her head, weighing regulator correspondence against customer relations. I thought then about the tapes. We had performed the ritual of custody for years. The tapes were wrapped and stored in a climate-controlled vault in Utah, a place whose name always felt slightly comical in its pastoral quiet. We had rehearsed the logistics, how to charter a plane, how to ensure chain of custody, how to get them to a certified facility for ingesting and rekeying. Those scripts existed in file cabinets and in the heads of a handful of people core to the operations.
They were not the subject of a town hall, but they would become the backbone of the months we had just initiated. There are human stories inside recovery actions. Someone buys airline tickets at midnight and sits on the plane with boxes of tapes on their lap. Someone spends days in a rehost facility, watching progress bars like prayers. People are laid off because contracts wither away while the rebuild happens. The drama that PR teams fear is not always the melodrama of scandal. It is the slow attrition of people and trust as the enterprise undertakes the work of making things whole again. I had, before that day, imagined many hypotheticals. I had not imagined being the one whose collar was snipped as part of a spectacle. That move felt like an inversion of a quiet ethic. We build systems so that the worst-case scenarios are guarded against, and yet leaders occasionally choose illusions that shortcut those precautions. When the automated messages began to refine themselves into official incidents, I sat in a small office looking at the screen and feeling the world narrow to a line of time and events. Someone typed into a corporate chat, "What do we tell the client?" I thought of how to tell partners that the rails they trusted had been intentionally rendered unavailable in order to protect them from another kind of unthinkable breach. There is a moral clarity there. Competence can look like an encumbrance until it is the thing that prevents catastrophe, but there is also cost. The company would be judged for that cost. PR would try to humanize the story. Opponents would attempt to monetize the chaos. I did something then that in retrospect was both practical and stubborn.
I called an old colleague at a contractor who had moved into a federal oversight role because she was likely to understand the nuance. The protocol had executed. We would trigger the contingency plan for cold recovery. She listened and then gave me 3 names to expect on the phone. Auditors who could, under certain conditions, begin a process to evaluate the scopes of work that had been immediately affected. Those conversations, mercifully administrative, are designed to convert panic into a set of steps. Steps can be measured. As the first wave of notifications propagated, as the auditorium emptied into the sorts of conversations that become subplots in corporate histories, I found myself thinking of the notarized memo in my lawyer's office. It felt like the difference between being portrayed as an obstructionist and being able to show that you had warned the organization in advance. It felt like a small, precious thing, a dated signature that forced a narrative to sit beside the actual sequence of events. The moral claim did not ease the operational obligations. My mind, those first hours, was cataloging immediate needs: secure custody of further keys, activation of incident response teams, communication strategy for federal contacts, and a list of physical logistics to retrieve Utah tapes. I began to think in the flat, efficient way of people who have to turn moral clarity into supply chains. The rest of the day blurred into protocol. Legal sealed external communications. Security logged every movement of any device. HR drafted tentative staffing plans for a potential contract slowdown. The board convened, not publicly, but in that peculiar private way executives convene when their numbers are at stake, and their reputations even more so. Kieran did not leave the building immediately. That detail matters only for what it revealed, whether he understood the gravity of what had happened. He paced the outer offices, eyes unfocused, occasionally looking at the titanium ring he held, like a child at the end of a show. I watched him from a distance. It would have been satisfying in a classical narrative sense to confront him, to scold, to demand accountability in the presence of witnesses. Real life is less tidy. I needed to set a path for the company to follow that was not about public humiliation or private vengeance. I needed a path that allowed the technical recovery to proceed without performative obstruction. When executive leaders asked me to sit with them, I set out conditions. I would lead the technical recovery as an independent consultant if the company agreed, in writing, to certain terms: indemnity for the logistical effort, the assurance that an honest public statement would be issued outlining executive interference, and the funding to charter the transport necessary to retrieve and re-ingest the trusted media. I did not make these demands out of hubris. I made them because the work they required exposed me to legal and reputational risk, and because the record needed to be clear about how we had arrived at the loss of critical keys. The board spaces hardened at the mention of public admissions. There is a reflex in executives to avoid narratives that can be monetized against them by competitors, regulators, or unhappy governments. There is also, paradoxically, a practical realism when the scales of loss are large enough to touch the bottom line. A $5 billion contract does not recover on nostalgia. It recovers on demonstrable continuity of service. Certifiers, auditors, and customers are often more pragmatic when the technical path back is credible.
It is easy in retelling to make virtue out of the terms I set. In the moment, it was simply necessary friction to ensure the work could proceed without forcing the narrative onto the shoulders of a single individual when the company itself had presided over the conditions that allowed the severance to happen. I insisted on indemnity not to punish, but because the work of reconstitution exposed me and my team to liability. We would be reconstructing systems on behalf of the company under scrutiny, and the record needed to be clean. They signed. There was no fanfare. A lawyer's email, a scanned signature, a promise that the public narrative would be calibrated. I remember Miriam's eyes in the meeting. She had the look of someone relieved to see facts lined up in a way that could be communicated to auditors without fabrications. That matters in governance. A messy truth is preferable to a polished lie when the consequence is national capability. By the time the sun dipped beneath the horizon outside, the first logistical plans were in motion. An operations manager began to itemize steps required to retrieve the Utah tapes, secure a private transport credential, prepare chain of custody forms, charter an aircraft if necessary to avoid baggage handling snafus. Our engineers prepared to assemble a cold room ingest, a physical space with trusted hardware untouched by network exposure. The work would be grueling, manual, and humiliating to those who had preferred the abstraction of the cloud. And yet, in that mechanical motion, there was the familiar clarity of a profession doing what it was trained to do: catalog, secure, transport, verify. The ruthless insistence on process that had once been described as pedantic suddenly looked like lifeboat training. Night came and the building emptied. Lights dimmed in offices where corporate music plays to keep energy high. I sat at my desk with a cup of tea that had gone cold and reread the notarized memo on my phone to steadied breath. I thought of the lives tethered to contracts, engineers with mortgages, program managers with children's tuition, guards with decades of service. I thought about how a single theatrical act could bleed into the livelihoods of dozens or hundreds. In the end, I understood that the moment of the scissors was not solely an act of personal hubris. It was a confluence of cultural forces, an organization that began to value visibility over discipline, a young executive who equated speed with progress, a management structure that signaled a willingness to sacrifice procedural nuance for optics. Those are not crimes, they are patterns. They leave consequences. The first night I slept in a hotel room a block from the campus because the logistics team had asked me to be ready to fly. I woke at an hour when the world is still that peculiar blur between consciousness and the mechanics of morning. My phone buzzed with messages from Marcus. Tapes prepped, chain forms ready. Another message from Miriam. Board will brief in the morning. And yet another from an unknown number. A federal oversight contact checking in politely to confirm receipt of the automated notice. The next day would be a ladder of actions, a certified manifest to retrieve tangible backups, a coordinated travel plan, a security play to keep the recovery trusted from end to end. It would also be the beginning of reputational triage, of communications calibrated for auditors and customers. There would be questions about staffing and contracts. There would be a public relations calculus. There would be people who left the company or were let go because the math no longer supported the payroll. But that would be the next day's problems. For the moment, with the titanium collar sitting inert on some conference table and the auditorium lights returning to the hum of office life, there was a simple, stubborn truth. We had sacrificed availability to protect against a risk that would have been worse if realized. The system had behaved as designed. It had prevented a potential catastrophic exfiltration by rendering the keys unreadable. It had activated the slow, arduous path of recovery. I put my hand on Marcus's shoulder as he pulled the chain of custody envelopes into a small locked bag. He nodded, the same tacit approval he had given me earlier. If we'd let him take it ceremonially, I said, we'd be having a different conversation. He looked at me with the expression of someone who had stood in server rooms and seen both small and large disasters. Sometimes, he said, the quiet thing is the right thing. People mistake speed for solution. There are people who, in the hours that followed, would try to fashion blame into a narrative that would satisfy shareholders and protect careers. There are others who would look for scapegoats or public villains. A public story can distill a dozen actors into a single image. The youngster with scissors, the custodian with a lanyard, the CEO who smiles and then writes a statement. But the technical truth is stubborn, and stubborn things are not improved by rhetoric. The module had interpreted an abrupt severance as a threat and had executed its policy. We could rebuild. We would rebuild. The tapes existed, and the logistics plan had begun. The work ahead would be physical, painstaking, and slow.
It would demand a different kind of vitality than the adrenaline of a town hall. I took a breath and began to lay out the plan for retrieving the Utah tapes. It was an unromantic list. Contact the storage vendor, secure transport, prepare a certified ingest environment, double-sign custody forms, and schedule a rekeying operation with hardware sourced from trusted manufacturers. Each item in that list was a small ritual of diligence. Each would take time. When I stepped back into the office, a message sat on my phone from someone at procurement. We are calculating potential immediate losses. Can you estimate impact on milestones? I typed a reply that felt like both confession and counsel. Immediate impact, facility clearance flagged, contract risk, material. Timeline for functional restoration from trusted media, measured in months. Recertification required. There is no instant override. That last sentence landed like a quiet statement. It is the kind of thing that boards and headlines do not want to hear, because it refuses the fantasy of a 10-minute repair. It is the professional humility of saying, the system protected the secret, and protection has a cost. By the time I left the building that night, the first charters were being priced, custody forms were being printed and notarized, and the board had scheduled a briefing with federal contacts. For me, the act of leaving the token severed around my neck began to settle into a shape I recognized. A catastrophe, properly framed, is a set of discrete problems to be solved. It is still a catastrophe. It is also solvable. But solvable did not mean painless. And that is why when I look back at the scissors' small decisive sound, what I see is not a single villainous image, but a stacked set of choices. Choices to prioritize optics, to reduce risk to a slogan, to mistake modernity for safety. Choices are not always malevolent. They are often convenient. They are the decisions that, in aggregate, make disasters plausible. I walked out into a gray evening feeling the weight of that clarity. The next steps would be physical: a plane to Utah, an ingest lab borrowed from a partner, a team assembled to rebuild from cold media. The legal and reputational work would be equally real. There would be press inquiries and customer calls. There would be people who lost jobs because a contract thawed into a loss of revenue. And there would be an inquiry, formal and detailed, that would examine who told whom what and when. As the skyline dimmed, I thought of the line in my notarized memo where I had written plainly, Project Velocity must not be allowed to replace the custody model without formal recertification. I had dated and signed it with a practiced hand. At the time, it felt like prudence. Now, it felt like a ledger entry in a longer book. The scissors had introduced an irreversible physical action. The memo was a record explaining that we had warned. When the phone rang that night, I answered. The caller ID read as a name I recognized, not from the company, but from a federal office that had been on the receiving end of automated incident messages before. "We read your notice," the voice said, careful and official. "We will be in touch. For now, maintain logs and do not attempt any ad hoc reconstruction that could complicate the investigation." I said, understood, and meant it. There is a discipline in being watched by federal auditors that sharpens the mind and narrows improvisation. The protocol that had burned our key had also protected national assets from stealthy theft. That paradox was the axis around which the next months would turn. I turned my phone off for a little while and tried to sleep. My dreams were not cinematic. They were procedural: a manifest checked twice, a tape box sealed with an X, a trusted engineer signing a line at the bottom of a custody form. When I woke, the world had not calmed. It had only begun to move through the motions that follow a trigger. The scissors' small sound had set off a long chain. If you have ever seen the spectacle of corporate theater masked as progress, tell me where you're watching from in the comments and subscribe for more inside stories. I will tell you how we moved from that ceremonial cut to the months of recovery that followed, the logistics, the people who paid the price, the federal interactions, and the hard truth about what competence looks like against performative noise. The charter was booked at dawn. There is a peculiar ritual to moving cold media at speed. It reads to outsiders like frantic bureaucracy. To those of us who have done it, it is choreography. The vendor in Utah required an attestation packet, a chain of custody manifest printed 3 times and signed in ink, and a certified escort. Our procurement team learned in a week how little of modern logistics is actually modern. You call people, you pay for airframes, you scrawl signatures on forms that will be examined under fluorescent lights forensically, and you organize people willing to sleep in the kinds of rooms that smell like ozone and regret. I insisted, and got agreement, that we treat the retrieval as if it were a scene in an opera, every entrance logged, every handoff witnessed. My insistence was partly professional stubbornness and partly self-preservation. The notarized memo in my lawyer's office had bought me the right to object. The company had by then agreed in writing to indemnify me for the work.
That contract was not theater, it was scaffolding. I would not set foot on a plane with other people's livelihoods inside a box unless the paperwork could be read by an auditor with a hard eye. The flight to Salt Lake was mercifully short.
A small team went. Me, Marcus, 2 engineers who had been cores of the ingest team for years, and an operations manager whose job for that week was to be a human checklist. Miriam had matters with regulators and could not leave. She stayed to handle the waterfall of inquiries. Jared, who had been at the edge of the storm from the beginning, did not come. There was a quiet understanding that his presence would not accelerate machinery we had to let do its own work. Utah is a countryside quiet. The tape vault sits in a site so prosaic that if you blink, you miss the fact that national secrets live inside. The vault's entrance was a dull metal door, a pair of cameras, and an iodine smell that reminded me of hospitals and laboratories. Federal auditors met us there in suits that were unintimidatingly neat. There were nods, professional, not theatrical, and a list of verifications that would make a litigator nod with appreciation. The boxes were heavy, wrapped in tamper-evident bands. Someone joked, badly, that we should have brought a dolly for the bruised hands. We did not laugh. We counted every box, initialed every seal, photographed the serial numbers of tape cartridges. The marshal's presence was procedural, an escort to ensure custody transfers were compliant with the terms that govern classified material. That presence grounded us in a slow legal gravity. When material like that moves, it must be traceable to the last breath. The ingest lab in Salt Lake smelled of clean metal and a different kind of heat, rack-mounted servers humming as if concerned. The lab was designed precisely to avoid the kinds of accidental exposures that delight adversaries. No external network, no USB ports that could be surreptitiously plugged in, a table for 2 people and 2 pairs of hands per machine. You bring cold media into that room like you bring a patient into surgery, carefully, sterilely, documented at every step. We inventoried headers and ran integrity checks. That is where the first surprise lived. Tapes are physical artifacts, and like all physical things, they age. There were frames that needed to be resynced, headers with signatures that had to be matched to manifests, and a handful of cartridges that required slow, patient relubrication to play correctly. We did what engineers do when confronted with entropy. We debugged the tape drive as if coaxing a temperamental animal, swapping heads, applying fresh media clamps, and when necessary, phoning a vendor rep who answered with professional resignation. At one point, an older engineer sat and hummed under his breath while he ran a drive recalibration, and such little rituals become the mood music of a long recovery. The data itself was a pale and stubborn thing. Logs, manifests, encrypted blobs whose encryption envelopes referred to keys that had been by then deliberately destroyed. Recreating the infrastructure around them required sequences of steps that could not be rushed. First, we restored unclassified operational metadata to understand workflow and dependencies. That told us what had been executed and when. Then we reconstructed the logical topology of the system, which services held references to which datasets, what certificates had been issued to which endpoints, and which components could be stood up independently of federal attestation versus which pieces required by regulation, a certified HSM, and an audited supply chain. There was an irony to the work. Modern culture tells engineers that the cloud is endless and thinkable. Our labor in that window was the opposite of metaphysical. It was muscle and patience, and the expertise to translate a tape's spin rate variance into a meaningful chunk of a database. I watched junior engineers learn in real time how to read a tape header and why the checksum values that show up in logs are less arcane trivia and more the heartbeat of trust. In parallel, legal and external relations started the slow negotiation dance with our federal partners. Federal auditors asked for manifests, for incident timelines, for the notarized memo, and for evidence that the incident was not a cover for a compromise. We handed them records, we shared the timestamps of the zeroization, we explained the policies encoded in the firmware. They listened in a tone that suggests anyone who has spent time in oversight is an expert in 3 things: verification, patience, and the representation of institutional memory. Weeks lengthened into months. The recovery was not one continuous narrative, but a set of overlapping arcs: the technical ingestion and rebuild, the regulatory audit and recertification, the corporate legal and PR handling, and the human story of livelihoods and trust. Each had its own tempo, and each bent the company's shape in different ways. Technically, the rebuild comprised 4 sequential milestones:
reconstruct the data from cold media, reinitialize clean hardware with new cryptographic identities under supervised conditions, verify that the reconstituted systems produced outputs identical to the certified artifacts in our contracts, and pass the third-party audits required for full clearance. The first milestone, data reconstruction, was what kept engineers awake at night. The second, hardware reinitialization, required sourcing certified Class 7 modules and establishing an attested supply chain for new HSMs. Manufacturers were cooperative but slow. Vetted HSMs are not consumer hardware. They come with background checks, vendor attestations, and a slow, bureaucratic grace that seems designed to test human impatience. The third and fourth milestones involved auditors with clipboards and endpoints who compared hashes and asked for recreation of sequences that had been anomalously interrupted.
We performed those rituals with an intensity that taught me once again that protocols are vows we make to institutions. Once you break them, reinstatement is not a matter of good work. It is a matter of proven reliability. During the ingest, there were setbacks that humbled even seasoned hands. An index file that mapped references to object stores had been corrupted in a way that required manual reconciliation. Someone had to read log streams and assemble object maps like the detective reconstructing an event from fragmented witness testimonies. It was tedious and exacting work. An engineer told me later that it felt like stitching a map from burned edges. There were nights when progress bars were small consolations, and the lab smelled of cold coffee and solder. The human cost began to consolidate into simple numbers: billable month slipping, customers recalculating risk, lenders running new stress tests. The board met more frequently. We prepared messaging that was honest but carefully measured. One pragmatic reality is that corporations are judged both by how they behave and by their ability to convince stakeholders they will behave reliably again. The cost of proving reliability is always higher than the cost of being reliable in the first place. There were layoffs. The math of lost revenue and reduced forecasts forces practical decisions. I remember sitting in a makeshift HR room as names were read from an HR list and managers explained to teams what the future would look like. People who had been with the company for years shuffled out with resignation letters and printed documents. Those departures were not dramatic. They were clipped, humanly pragmatic. People took their boxes, hugged colleagues, and walked into uncertain futures. I have carried their faces with me as a moral ledger. They did not deserve what happened, but they bore part of its consequence. Meanwhile, the board had to contend with accountability. They appointed an independent review. Miriam coordinated the production of a statement that, in the end, acknowledged executive interference contributed to operational disruption, a phrasing sifted by counsel and polished by PR. It was not an admission of criminality. It was a corporate-level acceptance that decisions had consequences. Kieran was stripped of the authority to sign programs within the portfolio. The board placed him on administrative leave pending an internal and regulatory review. Language like pending investigation was used in memos because regulators read such words as invitations to act. No one in the company drafted anything that read like absolution or verdict. Those were matters for independent processes. There were also private reckonings. Lawrence Ashford, who had stood in the auditorium smiling as if life were a gallery, called me one evening and asked, with a bluntness some children reserve for parents, "Aerys, what would you have done differently in that room?"
It was a question of leadership and tone. I answered not with rhetoric, but with professional observation. We should have institutionalized slower transitions and formalized ceremony into process. The optics of change are not a substitute for documented recertification. He listened, quietly. Later, a public statement appeared, in which the company acknowledged errors in judgment during the Project Velocity rollout and promised an independent review. That statement, carefully worded, did what such statements do best. It opened space for institutional repair without the melodrama of public shaming. It also, privately, set conditions for how the company would negotiate with federal partners to restore confidence. The negotiation to get auditors to return access was painstaking. Auditors required evidence of a secure chain of custody for the replacement HSMs. They wanted documented, supervised key generation events. They demanded that all reinitializations occur under third-party observation. We scheduled windowed events where we would power up new HSMs, generate keys in their secure enclaves in the presence of auditors, and prove that the newly generated keys could sign artifacts that, when compared against our reconstructed archives, produced the same operational results. It is worth saying plainly, the rhetoric of restore with a new key is not magic. You can make a new key, you cannot make the old key reappear. The burden of proof for the government was not to recover what was lost, but to ensure that the new infrastructure performed exactly as expected and that the chain of custody and attestations were credible. During the months that followed, we performed key ceremonies that felt both ceremonial and precisely technical. The room where we generated keys was dim, with only task lights over the HSMs.
Auditors watched as keys were generated, and every step was photographed and logged. An engineer read aloud the entropy sources as if reciting liturgy, and we all took, in our different ways, the small humility of being present for a procedural miracle, the restoration of trust. Each successful signing operation was a small victory. Each failure taught us where our assumptions had been fragile. At the same time, customers reevaluated their dependencies. Some had been patient, others took the operational pause as an opportunity to source alternative providers. I do not say this with relish. The market is indifferent. Contracts are portfolios. A government client who must sustain logistics in uncertain theaters will prioritize continuity over loyalty. We lost parts of the $5 billion program's tasking to competitors who had pre-positioned redundant capacity. Those losses were calculable and painful. They translated into permanent revenue declines and forced a further round of restructuring. Recovery in corporate metrics is not often a return to the previous state. It is a renegotiation of what the firm can responsibly promise.
Through all of it, I kept a ledger of small, consequential gestures. The notarized memo, the attorney file, the chain of custody photographs. When federal investigators arrived to conduct interviews, those items were the evidence that our narrative was not defensiveness, but documentation. Investigations are not trials. They are examinations of process. We cooperated. We showed our documents, we produced our logs, we explained the token's decision tree in the same measured way I have rehearsed now. That cooperation was necessary because the penalty for resisting oversight is far worse than the inconvenience of transparency. At some point in the middle months, there was a quiet meeting with a senior official from a federal oversight body who had been following the incident. He did not appear in a suit so much as an understated cardigan and the kind of patience that comes from long service. He told me privately that our operation had done exactly what it was designed to do: make theft of materials more costly than sabotage. He added, with that bureaucratic candor people who have seen systems for years adopt, that the incident would lead to policy revisions around public demonstrations of decommissioning and new guidance about executive involvement in custody procedures. That conversation mattered because it suggested a kind of moral recompense. Systems designed to deny attackers their prize had done so at expense for those they were designed to protect. It is ugly and moral at once. Competence can demand sacrifice. There were darker moments. Rumors spread in corridors. Employees whispered about whether their careers had a future. A few people who had been aggressive advocates of Project Velocity took their chances and left for startups, where speed and optics were prized. Others, who had preferred quiet diligence, found new work in organizations that valued the discipline they had demonstrated. Corporate life rearranged itself naturally. The survivors resorted into firms aligned with their temperaments. I was rehired by the company as an independent consultant once the immediate crisis assessment was complete. My team and I were given a 6-month retainer to complete reconstruction, documentation, and to shepherd recertification. I accepted because the work needed to be done, and because I believed the organization, at least in part, still had a mission in service to a public good. That retainer came with terms we had insisted upon: clear indemnity, a public statement acknowledging the executive interference, and funding to cover the logistical cost of a rebuild. Those were not punitive demands. They were precautions. When professional knowledge intersects with public accountability, you insist on clarity. The months that followed were a series of small triumphs and public setbacks. We managed to re-ingest the bulk of the operational data from the Utah tapes and rebuild test environments. We stood up certified hardware, performed audited key ceremonies, and proved to a forensic standard that the systems behaved as specified. Slowly, piece by piece, certifications were restored. Not all at once, not without caveats. The certification authorities issued scope-limited clearances that allowed certain classes of work to resume, while the most sensitive taskings required additional controls. Customers resumed orders in phases. Some work returned, some did not. The company emerged smaller and more cautious. Executives who had pushed for rapid modernization found their influence diminished. Kieran was moved from his operational role and placed under internal review. He faced regulatory inquiry and internal disciplinary processes. The paperwork that lined our legal team's inbox suggested ongoing investigations, not final adjudications. That, too, is an essential distinction. Organizations must be careful not to conflate consequence with criminality. We had endured a severe policy and operational breach of one kind. Legal determination was another matter. There were public relations cycles, media inquiries, op-eds, and analysts who turned the incident into a cautionary tale of leadership style versus institutional rigor.
Some narratives insisted on moral clarity, others preferred a simpler kid with scissors portrait. Both were partial. It always has been the case that public stories compress complexity, and the compressed stories are easier to digest. My work, the forensic logs, and the notarized memo, however, were not compressible narratives. They were evidence of a chain of decisions. At the operational finish line, we achieved the core objective. Trusted systems capable of performing the tasks required by our clients were restored under renewed certification. That restoration was not a return to the exact layout of the past. We had fresh hardware and a new set of documented processes. We had learned, painfully, to formalize anti-theatrical procedures into the policy manual. No public decommissioning without audited steps, no ceremonial gestures involving devices that could be read as coercion, and a clear line for handling proposed changes to custody. The company paid a price. Fewer employees, a smaller share of the original contract, and reduced investor confidence. But it persisted. That persistence is not a triumphal narrative so much as a sober fact. Competence and stubborn diligence had not made the loss disappear. They had made the company credible enough to retain part of its portfolio and to continue contributing to national capability. What happened to the people is the measure I keep returning to. Marcus stayed. He had no interest in becoming a corporate symbol. He wanted, in small human ways, to do his job and to be recognized for it. Miriam remained, but with new scars, the kind that teach a council to insist on documented processes before PR makes a statement.
Jarrett left. The pull of a different culture, the weight of being associated with a catastrophic misstep, and the chance to rebuild elsewhere motivated him. Karen, as I said, was moved from decision authority and faced internal and regulatory review. The board retooled the corporate governance documents to make it harder for spectacle, however well-intended, to substitute for process. And then, at the end of that long arc, the quiet thing occurred. Federal agencies reached out to me with an offer that felt less like a job and more like a transfer of trust. I was approached about advising on program resilience across a series of contractors whose work interfaced with national logistics. The offer was not merely flattering. It was an acknowledgement that the discipline I had shown, documenting concerns, insisting on process, and refusing to play along with a public stunt, had value beyond our firm. I do not tell you that to boast. I tell it because institutions sometimes recognize the cost of competence and sometimes extend invitations to those who practiced it under fire. I accepted a limited advisory role. That role was not an escape from the messy human cost. It was a chance to try to make systems less brittle in the face of the next theatrical impulse. If there is a moral to this long sequence, it is not the simplistic lesson learned a PR deck might weaponize. The moral is technical and moral at once. When you design a system to be irreproducible, you must accept the consequences of irreproducibility. That acceptance includes the political and human cost that comes with doing the right thing under dramatic circumstances. Sometimes protecting an asset requires rendering it temporarily unavailable. That choice is unspectacular. It is heavy and methodical and bureaucratically ugly. But it prevents another, worse outcome: silent theft that might not announce itself until a nation noticed. There is another conclusion, quieter and harder. Competence is a kind of moral courage. It is not about glory. It is about making prudence visible in a way that withstands the glare of a camera. The notarized memo, the printed forms, the sealed tape boxes, they are all artifacts of a discipline that refuses to be rhetorical. When governance is measured, it must be demonstrable. Performances do not substitute for that. If the story has a personal endpoint, it is this: I have not enjoyed the headlines. I have not sought a platform. My job was to build and protect, and then, when protection exacted a price, to participate in the painstaking work of restoration. I do not begrudge that work. I begrudge only the reflex that equates speed with genius, and that confuses spectacle with stewardship. You asked in the comments where you were watching from the moment that scissors cut. Thank you to those of you who wrote, from small startups, from federal operations, from dorm rooms and server closets. The sentiment in those messages mattered. It reminded me that stewardship is not purely the province of a few. It is a practice worth learning. If there is a concrete piece of advice I can leave anyone who runs or influences technical organizations, it is simple. Institutionalize slowness where consequence is high. Make a ceremony a checklist. If you must perform a public transition, ensure the public performance is built on a foundation of audited steps. And when someone with authority asks you to perform a break in custody in front of an audience, treat that as an inflection point that requires written approvals, not applause. We recovered part of what we had. We did not recover everything. The company returned to a different baseline. People lost jobs and trust. Others gained a clearer sense of purpose. There was no neat cinematic reckoning. There was a sequence of professional endurance and slow reconstitution. The public narrative trimmed itself into headlines, but those headlines never fully captured what happens when a system sacrifices availability to deny theft.
The real story lived in the day rooms at the ingest lab, in the cramped hotels where engineers slept and rebooted at ungodly hours, and in the small piles of signed custody forms that, when laid end to end, resembled the slow proofs that trust is not an abstraction. If this account resonates with you, if you want more insight stories about the quiet work that keeps dangerous things safe, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you've been in a similar situation, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. We learn, in the end, from each other's attention. I do not apologize for being the anchor. We are not averse to progress. We are defenders of the rules that make progress safe. If you value that, say so. The rest of the world will keep chasing the bright thing. Someone needs to mind the locks.